Welcome back. We will start with lecture 3 today. In lecture 2, we have looked at the variational learning model, and we talked about what the model basically means and how it works. Now, let us look at some of the evidence in favor of the model, and then some evidence that do not seem to go along with the model, and then we will look at constructivism as a possible alternative to this theory. So, with VLM we are still with the nativist perspective. Now, the very VLM primarily posits that we do have parameters, we do have principles and we do have parameters, but the usage of those parameters will depend on a probabilistic occurrence. So, depending on how often a particular format, particular type of input the person gets, the child gets, accordingly that format will be rewarded. So, let us say the tense marking, plus tense marking, minus tense marking, these two are the on and off condition of the tense marking parameter. Now, if the child hears the child switches on the plus tense marking and then continuously hears plus tense marked sentences, then that format gets rewarded, because this is fitting the analysis of the parameter that has been set. However, if the parameter is set on and the child listens to more often, he or she listens to the sentences that has tense marking, then it will be kind of punished. So, it will not be used anymore. So, this is how the child is supposedly understands the which of the parameters to be used and how to set. So, it is not a fixed one, it depends on the kind of input the child gets. So, the probability of one type over another is what is the primary takeaway from this model. It is a simplified version. Now, does this theory take care of any of the existing problems? It seems so. Remember, we talked about the co-occurrence of error and inflection at the same time. So, if the going by the nativist theory, if the child has figured out the rule of the parameter of the language, that this will be a tense marked language, and then there should not be any option of any error. So, it is like either or, you either get the rule or you do not get the rule, but you cannot get the rule and still make mistakes. So, that is where VLM seems to have an answer for that, have an explanation for that, because this theory explains the question of the co-occurrence of both inflected version as well as the errors in this way. So, child is initially undecided, because both options are readily available to the child, both the plus and the minus tense marking, let us say, or plus or minus argument marking, or whichever way, any of the parameters we can take, and the child has both the options in the beginning. Now, as the child hears plus tense structure, that grammar gets reinforced and then the minus tense grammar gets pushed back, or let us say it is called punished. So, it is punished, the minus tense format is punished. So, over time the child stops using the minus tense grammar and sticks to the plus tense grammar. So, that is why initially if you have set one format, that is why you can see there are problems even though they get it. So, they are in the process of understanding, hence sometimes they get it correct, sometimes they do not. So, they are undecided. It is kind of an yo-yoing between plus and minus, and how the child finally fixes on one. So, that is the time period when we see the co-occurrence of both the errors as well as the correctly inflected structures. So, that is why also that is why the child gets better over time. This is going back to our maturation theory within this entire framework. So, while initially in the beginning stages, in the initial stages they do have problem, but over a period of time through maturation they do get better. Similarly, there is the other problem of delay in error correction. So, that can also be explained by this theory. So, this depends on the ambiguity, the nature of the input. This theory, because this is dependent on the child checking the underlying grammar with the input. So, they have the parameters and they need to check it with the kind of sentences that they come across, and then accordingly tick one or the other option. So, now if the problem is current, if the input grammar, input sentences that the child is exposed to, if it has ambiguity of any kind, then this will create problem in error correction. So, if there is no clear signal that the child gets, then there will be a delay. So, the more ambiguity there is in the speech input, the more delay the child will experience. So, that is how this model tries to understand the theory. So, if the speech input is ambiguous, then there will be a delay. So, may not always give the clear indication of the correct grammar overtly. So, not always we are mindful of the grammatical correctness or grammaticality of the sentences, or even the fact that there is a child in the environment who probably is picking up. That is not how we are not conscious about that. When adults speak, they are not really conscious, but everything that is there in the environment is input for the child. So, this might create problem. So, they give an example like I like. You can just change this sweet with anything else. So, I like X, and you can also have sentences like I want to like sweets, but cannot in case I have diabetes. Now, the use of the verb in two different forms, though without overt marking. So, in this case I like, I want, both are in the I like here and like here. So, both are in the non-marked condition, in the sense there is no overt marking on the verb. So, like in the first case is I like sweets. So, there is no marking after, so as it will happen, for example, if third person likes. So, somebody else, Ananya likes sweets. So, in that case there will be an S marked. That is what we talked about in the previous lecture. So, that S in English language stands for a lot of meanings. So, it has many things packed into one, but in case of the first person singular, the like remains as it is, like. Similarly, I want to like sweets. So, in that case it is the to form, in the to verb form. Here also it has no marker. So, these kind of inputs probably creates a confusion in the child's mind as to which one is the tensed one, which one is non-tensed one, which is the infinitive form and which is the tensed form. That is not very clear, because the overt marking is not there. So, as a result of which there might be a delay. So, this problem also has some kind of an explanation in the VLM format. Similarly, you have cross linguistic difference in error rate, that was also discussed in the previous lectures, that languages do not seem to follow the same rule. And so, if the child has made more errors in language X, does not mean they will make the same kind of errors in the same category in language Y. So, cross linguistically there are differences in terms of the kind of errors the child makes. Now, how does that happen? VLM seems to have an answer for that as well. So, because languages differ in terms of the ambiguities, we just talked about ambiguity in English language, but not all languages allow that kind of a format. There are languages where for each instance of the verb there has to be a overt marker, there has to be a the tense marking or the agreement marking, whatever it is, has to be there. So, that means there are some languages that are more ambiguous, some languages that are less ambiguous, and there are more which will be in between. So, it is a spectrum. So, depending on where in that spectrum the language lies, it will decide the kind of errors and how long the errors continue in that language. So, the same understanding of ambiguity in the sense of lack of overt marking of the morphological features. That is the kind of ambiguity we are talking about. We are not talking about semantic ambiguity here. So, for example, the Spanish children converge on the plus tense grammar quickly, because they do not in their case you do not see the kind of delay that you see in, let us say, English children. Why it happens? Because Spanish utterances are unambiguously marked for tense. So, there is no confusion there, they do mark. As a result of which you see Spanish children learning this distinction very quickly, and they converge on that in this language I have to switch on the plus tense structure, there is no confusion about it. So, that is how. French has moderate amount of ambiguity, and hence French children take moderate amount of time. So, there is a neat format within which the language structure, the kind of the amount of ambiguity and the kind of delay that the children show, there seems to be some sort of an equivalence. So, this is also fine. Even individual differences among children has been explained with this model. So, now we see differences in terms of languages. Now, we have already seen differences in terms of languages. Now, we see differences in terms of even within the same language, but different children having different pace of learning. Not every child attains the same level of proficiency or same level of mastery of language at exactly the same time. So, this also has been explained by the same theory, that the parameter here has to be the children's home language. If the home language is less ambiguous, if they have the kind of input that are more beneficial for children to learn those structures, if they are more in the home environment, then they will learn it faster. That is how the correlation has been provided. So, how fast or slow they are able to converge, how fast or slow they are able to finally switch on the parameter depends on what kind of input they are getting in their home, in spite of, let us say, the language having language X having a very clear cut plus tense kind of a structure, not much of ambiguity, but what if at home the language is sometimes more informal. Let us say some languages also have variations. So, the formal variation is something that we use outside home, the informal variation you use at home. Now, the informal variation does not mark the tense on all situations, on all occasions. What if that is the situation? So, in that case, a child will be at a disadvantage to converge on the exact structure that this language allows. So, these are the kinds of explanations that VLM has provided with respect to these problems. Now, there are some problems as well. There are some issues that have been pointed out. One is that why different verbs have different error rates. Keeping everything same, some verbs have more errors compared to others. We have seen before in the previous lecture the difference between the eventive versus the stative verbs. So, if those are the differences, now both of them are high frequency verbs, and still there is a difference between the nature of the verbs. So, VLM does not seem to be able to answer this kind of a problem. Now, let us move on to constructivist theory. This is the other approach. We have been following this two-way distinction of the approach of language acquisition, nativist versus constructivist. So far we have been looking at the nativist theory and two different paradigms. Now, we will move on to constructivist theory. Now, constructivist theory does not believe in any innate grammar. So, they do not believe in this theory does not believe in either principles or parameters, forget about the switching on and off of parameter, no parameter at all. Here the theory believes that posits that children learn through rote learning from input in the initial stages, and after a point they are able to generalize across memorized strings on the basis of commonalities. So, similar kind of words appearing in similar position in the sentences, having similar kind of meaning, and thereby they are able to generalize across context on a category of words, let us say. So, even though they start at the lexical level, over a period of time they will be gradually building up the abstract knowledge about their own language. So, they will start with, let us say, a few words like walk, walked, talked, like that, and then they will notice that this kind of words always appear at a particular position in the sentence, and they seem to always talk about some kind of an action and so on, and over a period of time they get the formula and then they generalize. So, then when they have achieved that level of understanding, that level of abstraction, then they are not anymore dependent on the lexical entities, because that is they have gone beyond that level and they have gone at a level of abstractions. Now, in terms of inflections, what do they say? they say that initially children start with the unanalyzed forms. So, they do not understand in the beginning that walk and walked are the same word, but in a different there is a modification depending on the tense. That is not how the initial input goes. Initially they take it as two different entities. So, this and this are two different words. However, they start as they get more and more input, because this theory is based primarily on input. So, as children are exposed to more and more input, they are able to, and the children also take part in creating the knowledge. It is not like the knowledge is handed down to them. So, they notice over this is some sort of a statistical learning, that over various multiple iterations similar kind of things happen. So, the pattern emerges. So, initially they start with that these are two different words, and then they realize that the position and the context appear to be similar, hence there is a rule at play here. So, there is some sort of a understanding that they generate. They are also able to generalize about the form and meaning mapping. So, if the child has already learnt words like walked, liked and wanted, she will be able to extract the verb plus ed structure, underlying structure, and apply it to other forms. So, a new word, even a nonsense word, if they hear, that is why they are able to create the proper inflectional properly inflected tense form of that verb. So, that is what happens after they have arrived at the v plus ed structure, underlying structure. So, based on these, there has been multiple studies have been carried out. We are not getting into all the details, but we will discuss only one model here. So, Mosaic is one computer model that implemented this constructivist theory. This model has no inbuilt knowledge of language, either syntax or morphology or any other kind. There is no inbuilt knowledge there. The entire system works on rote learning. So, depending on the input that you give, the machine learns the language and learns to understand how to use the inflections and so on. So, it rote learned strings of words from the input. First they learn the words and memorize them on the basis of distributional commonalities. That is what we talked about just now, that there is a similarity in terms of the position, in terms of the meaning and so on. So, the same theory applies to this model. So, first they learn they go through a rote learning process, and then they understand some distributional commonality, and initially the model as a result makes mistakes as it learned from the beginning and end of the sentences. So, the model was created in such a way that dependent on the input sentences, the model focused primarily on the first and the last part of the sentence. So, the first part is the subject, the last part is of course. So, in a sentence like this is quoted from the work. So, Cicely wants to eat cake. So, what the model memorizes is Cicely and eat cake, and hence the model gave an output like Cicely eat cake. Now, if that is how the model is memorizing, then what will happen is initially they will create the bare word, there is no inflection that is there. So, initially the model made mistakes like this, but after some point, after some time, as the learning continued, and what learning continued means is that the system had more inputs to work on. So, testing and trial and so familiarization and the testing you can call it. So, that kind of a system this model also goes through. So, the more the training data, the better it got. That is the idea. So, the model over a period of time learned to create longer sentences and correct ones with the proper inflection that was required. So, this study was carried out by this group in 2010. So, they found out, they compared once the system was in place, they compared the performance of the model, the Mosaic model with the VLM with respect to some speech data that they collected. So, they analyzed the spontaneous speech of 14 mothers and their children across 5 different languages. So, English, Dutch, German, French and Spanish, all the languages that we have been giving examples from. So, some of the major European languages, they collected data from the mother's speech with the children. speech of mother and children. And then, so how the process went? So, at first the variation model was checked for the predicted errors, what kind of error the model gave out, and then the same speech data was used for the mosaic model to see if the model can will make the same kind of mistake or will it have a better result with respect to the same speech data. And so, the same speech data was used for the kind of error it will produce. So, what was the result? Result was very interesting. Result was for most of the child's errors, both VLM and mosaic performed similarly. So, whatever VLM predicted, the children had actually made that kind of mistake. Similarly, mosaic the model, whatever kind of mistakes the model made, a similar kind of mistakes the child also made. So, there was a largely speaking, there was similarity between the two models with respect to the data. But only mosaic could predict which verbs were more likely to have errors. This is something that the VLM could not, that is something we have already seen, and as was predicted, VLM could not predict this kind of a difference between the different verbs having different level of errors. So, that was predicted by mosaic. So, this was one interesting case. Another case where this model provides a satisfactory answer is the case of differential rate of error in some auxiliaries and inflections than others. This is explained with the concept of frequency. So, the higher the frequency of occurrence of a particular kind of structure, the better the model will perform. So, this is kind of understood. High frequency morphological structures will be learnt more easily than those that are of low frequency. So, for example, the child continuously hears past tense in the household, they are more likely to learn past tense more easily compared to let us say future tense hypothetically. So, the more the kind of the training data for that you give, the better that machine will get in that aspect. So, it is entirely dependent on the input, and that is why, that is how it can answer the differences as well. Finally, the gradual acquisition of inflectional morphology, that also, why does it happen over a period of time? That is the same reason, because the earliest forms are restricted to rote learning, because they did not say that the machine learns the system in the very beginning. As soon as they are exposed, they already know, which is the understanding by the nativist theory. Nativist theory says that the system is already in place. So, there is no room for development, room for improvement, but the constructivist theory says that there is always an ample room for improvement, because initially there is a rote learning. Over a period of time, they will look at similarities, they will look at the distribution of the words and in the structures and meanings, and over a period of time they will master it. So, naturally this model has a better explanation for the gradual acquisition of inflectional morphology. Why is it that some morphological structures are acquired first and some are later? So, there were many studies, but one of the well known ones is on Spanish speaking children. Initial children under study produced only one form of inflection per word. So, there was whichever was high frequency. So, let us say with walked was most frequent, but not walking. So, they kept producing walked in many cases even when it is not relevant. Over a period of time, they realized that each word can have different kinds of inflectional structures, and then they started producing them, but this dependent on the frequency. So, if the past tense marker is high frequent, that will be the first one to be acquired. Future tense will be acquired later if it is less frequent, and so on. So, that is exactly what they found out also. So, gradually the children learn to use other forms with the same verbs. Makes sense, but then there are some evidence against mosaic also. Evidence as in, there are some cases where mosaic could not answer the questions that arose. One was the error of creating a bare form is higher than expected given the input, because when you compare, because this model is based on comparing the occurrence of words in different formats across context. So, given keeping that as a constant, the use of bare forms continues for quite a long time for children. This has been already attested. We have discussed it as well, that bare forms continue to be to figure in the child's speech for a very long time. Why does it happen? Because the input is not always in bare form. So, that is one problem. Also, the same group looked at mosaic, that it had more errors in Dutch than in English. Now, this form gave this model gave out predicted more errors in Dutch than in English. However, in reality children make errors the opposite way. Children make more errors in English as opposed to Dutch. So, this is another area that could not be that they found out with that has a problem with mosaic. So, this is in a nutshell what the model talks about. Secondly, pronouns are reported to have fewer errors than nouns, as pronouns are said to be learnt using high frequency slots, because pronouns are high frequency. So, I, you, he, they are very high frequent words. So, naturally pronouns are supposed to have lesser errors as opposed to nouns, but in a control study this was also contested in a control study by Guo et al., in which they looked at they had a very narrow age range of the children, and there they used the elicitation technique for children to produce sentences, and there they found that similar kind of errors in nouns and pronouns were produced by the children. So, this is also another domain that the mosaic model does not seem to have an answer for, because we are talking about the frequency, we are talking about what is easier to learn and so on. So, this is also another recent finding that does not seem to answer. Thus, if we need to conclude the comparison between these two theories, both nativist and constructivist theories have proved to be useful in explaining various issues with respect to acquisition of inflection markers. However, both have a few issues, only few issues that seem to have been unexplained so far. So, of course, the debate does not end here. There are many more works that have been published, and there are debates going on still. For those who are interested, I will be adding them all the references. You can look up for advanced understanding of the topic, but this is the baseline. These are the fundamental ideas with respect to nativist and constructivist debate on this. Now, let us look at another interesting debate within this domain, which is the debate called past tense debate. Now, English past tense has been the topic of a very long debate in terms of its processing. How do children learn? How do children learn the past tense, specifically that of the irregular verbs? Now, English language has two different kinds of verbs. The regular verbs have a very simple lifespan. They just take the ed morpheme and they become past tense. But the irregular verbs have a completely different life journey altogether. So, this is where the problem is. How do children understand, how do children figure out what happens, what is the underlying mechanism. So, regular inflection of ed is learnt easily by children and even overgeneralized very often. On the other hand, the irregular verbs in English there are about 180 of them. They cannot be generalized in the same way. In fact, they are often victims of overgeneralization by the regular verbs. So, there are different, we will discuss only two different theories here. One of the important theories is about words and rules theory. Words and rules theory says that lexicon and grammar are two different parts of the language faculty of the human mind. So, it is not only grammar, but there is lexicon also. Lexicon consists of all the words that the language has, and this also includes the irregular verbs. So, irregular verbs are considered as lexical entities and not as the the result of some rule governed phenomenon. So, that is how the difference is. Even though they have a grammatical feature of past tense incorporated into them, but they are, according to this theory, they are processed as lexical entities rather than as grammatical entities. So, on the other hand, regular verbs are productively generated by rules. So, these two categories of verbs hence should not be considered as the similar kinds. So, on the one hand, the regular verbs are created by adding the inflectional morpheme, and on the other hand, the irregular ones are stored and memorized as lexical entities as it is. So, this is a very quite a well known publication by Pinker and Ullman, where they describe this. So, irregular forms do not require an exception module. So, it is not an exception, they are a different category on their own, that is the idea here. Two subsystems can overlap in their expressive power. So, what they mean by expressive power is the grammatical function. So, the two subsystems are the lexical and the grammatical subsystem, both are part of the super ordinate node of language faculty. So, in the some entities in the lexicon and some entities in the grammatical category can have similar kind of grammatical purpose, or what is they call expressive power. So, even if they belong to two different subdomains, but they have the similar kind of. So, overlapping is in terms of the function that they perform in the sentence. So, a given combination of features or syntactic role can be expressed either by words or by rules. The role is similar, role is to express the time of the event with respect to the time of speaking, which is let us say past tense. So, this happened before now. So, this idea can be expressed either by a word or by a grammatical rule. They do not have to be from the same stock, and if they are not from the same stock, then there is no question of exception. That is what they are meaning by meaning when they say that exception module is not needed, because only when you put everything under one rule, then you say that okay, these are the this is a list of words that do not follow the rule, hence they are exception to the rule. Here that question does not arise at all. They can be in a different category, but still perform the same function. Now, if we compare this theory with the classical generative theories, there are some differences. In the traditional generative theory of Chomsky and Hell, and the irregular forms are generated by affixing an abstract morpheme to the stem and applying rules that alter the stem's phonological composition. So, from this perspective, most irregular forms are not completely arbitrary. So, there is some sort of a rule applying there as well. So, they call it, they fall into families of displaying certain kinds of patterns. So, they give examples like ring, rang, sing, sang, sit, sat, like this. So, this is also another group. This is another family of, let us say, families of categories of words, categories of formats. So, there is a rule, there is an affixing of a morpheme, and then thereby you change the phonological nature, phonological composition of the word. So, that is exactly what is happening here. So, this is not an outlier in that sense, they are not completely arbitrary. The problem with this position is that there are too many irregular verbs in this language, in English language, too many different types of irregularities, let us say. So, if you need to have a theory for each of them, you need too many theories, and also you need to have too many exceptions. So, that is a problem with looking at the irregular verbs from the traditional generative framework. Now, we have another model, which is the RMM model, which actually comes from a connectionist model that Rummelert and McClellan proposed. This model basically looks at this entire problem with respect to a pattern associator model. So, there is a pattern that get associated, and this is how they countered the word and rule theory. So, this is the debate, the past tense debate is between the RMM and the word and role theory. So, as per this RMM model, this learning takes place through association of phonological features of the stem with phonological features of the past tense form. So, it is not, the association is not between words, but the association is between the phonological form of the word and the past tense form. So, that is what the association happens at that level, not at the word level. So, the pattern associator links sounds to sounds rather than linking a word to a word stored in the memory. Now, this in order to understand what this theory actually means, we need to go back one step, because this theory is part of the overall connectionist model proposed by Rummelert and McClelland. This theory also is known as parallel distributed processing. It is not possible to describe that entire theory in a short time like this, but let me just so this theory was opposed to the idea of linear and modular theory of mental functions. Mental functions, there are different theories as to how the human brain functions. One of the theories say that the mind is modular. So, there are different domains, there are different modules in the brain, each of them taking care of a separate function. Connectionist model on the other hand say that mental functions arise out of a complex network of connected units. That is the most important aspect of this theory, that is why the name connectionist model. So, there are different domains in the brain, different regions work together. This is a connected, very well connected network of system that gives rise to any kind of mental faculty. So, language included, language is another mental faculty. So, this also has the same kind of a understanding. So, learning in this model is primarily based on associations and patterns, and that is what we talked about just now. So, the patterns and associations here are based on the sound system rather than on the words in this, as per this model is concerned. So, this is in a simplified version. So, similar words have words with similar sounds, that is what they mean by similar. So, similarity is on the basis of sounds, and then their representations are also partly superimposed. So, when you figure out the similarity, then the representations get superimposed. Now, this allows such models to acquire families of similar forms more easily than arbitrary sets, and then it generalizes the patterns to new similar words. For example, if the system is exposed to words like fling becoming flung and similarly cling to clung, then and this because they sound similar, right. So, similar sounding words has similar sounding similar kind of system, similar kind of pattern. So, that kind of gets superimposed, that if it is fling and becomes flung, then cling will become clung, and now you give another similar sounding word like spling, it does not this does not exist, but they will be able to, the system will be able to create splung as an output. So, that is how the system apparently learns as far as this theory goes. Of course, this is a very watered down analysis of the model, but I get the point. Similarly, flip becoming flipped, clip becoming clipped, if that is how the system is, then it will result into another nonsense word like plip, it will become plipped. So, that is how this model is supposed to work. However, of course, like all other models, this also has its share of problems. For instance, later studies have pointed out that there are some odd structures that the model generates. For example, male and it becomes membled, tilb, trilate. So, for novel words, sometimes they create really odd kind of an output or no output at all. So, there are some limitations of the model where it does not seem to function very well. Of course, the model has gone through. So, the initial model was given in the 1980s and eventually there have been updates on that model. So, later models tried to solve this by adding some rules to the model as to how it really works. So, and even more recent models have to quote Pinker, have given up on generating past tense forms altogether. Their output layer now contains one unit for every past tense change, turning inflection into a multiple choice test. So, basically this model also has run into issues, run into some problems with respect to the past tense marker as to how the past tense forms really work with respect to the irregular verbs. So, this is in a nutshell the comparison between the RMM, which is the part of the connectionist model by Rumelert and McClellan, and the word and rules model as proposed by Pinker and others. So, these are the two different sides of the past tense debate. Past tense as in how the regular versus irregular verbs get their past tense marking correct. What happens? What is the rule and how are they represented in the mind? So, this is where we will complete this lecture. In the next lecture, we will take up some other issues, and then eventually we will look at also the blocking hypothesis and other cases. Thank you.